Here we're going to look at using passwords on your devices, just a simple password, and then we'll briefly look over AAA and some of the enhancements that will allow for access to our devices and our network. The very first line of defense for our devices are just passwords only, so we'll just look at only configuring passwords. So I'm configuring a router, and I have some options just to configure passwords. So any user that comes into that router and wants to administer or do anything with it needs to have these passwords. The first is the enable password or the privileged exec password. So you know when you go into a router, when you first get into the router, you get user mode. You can't really do a lot with user mode, so if you want to configure anything or do some of the more advanced show commands, you're going to need to get into privileged exec mode or enable mode. And you would do that by typing the word enable at the beginning. And then likely, or it should, assuming you configure enable password, it would ask for a password, and then you type that password in before you can get into that level. So in this example, we have two options to configure an enable password. We can use simply the enable password command, so enable password and then the password that you want to use. In this example, it was test pass, so enable password test pass, or we can use the enable secret command. Similar to the previous command, except for we use the word secret instead of password, so enable secret and then whatever I want my password to be. The difference is the enable password encrypts the password that I gave you or that you configured. It will encrypt it in the router, and it's a more basic, simpler to decrypt sort of password, whereas enable secret will actually hash the password, create a hash out of the password. Next, we can configure VTY and console line passwords. VTY lines are often used for remote access, so if I want to telnet or SSH into the device, I would come in through the virtual line or the VTY line. So in order to configure a password there, we simply do line VTY and then the number of lines that I want to put a password on. Here we're doing 0 to 4. So go into the line by typing line VTY 0 space 4 and then the word password and whatever you want your password to be. In this example, it's VTY pass. So if I come in from a telnet client, say, such as PuTTY, and I telnet to this device, whatever the IP address of this device is, it's going to ask for a password, at which point I'd type in VTY pass. And then as I'm configuring this line, I need to type in login. What login does, that login command down there, what it does is it tells the device to ask for a password. Without it, it actually won't even ask for the password. Next, we do the console line, so coming in, physically counseling in with a physical console cable. People are automatically allowed in, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we at least configure a password on the console line. So again, similar to the VTY line, we do a line con, which is short for console, space 0, and then password, and in this example, the password's con pass. And again, we have to type in the login command to tell the device to prompt for a password when someone tries to come into the console line. Now, passwords are a pretty basic method, and it doesn't take much for someone to just crack a simple password. What we can do is we can take it one step further, and we can use a username and a password. We can specify further what a person is allowed to do once they're logged in with their username and their password. And then lastly, we can actually pay attention to exactly what they're doing and how long they're doing it for. That's AAA. So AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Authentication means who is allowed to use the resources. Okay, they're going to provide some sort of username and password to get access to those resources, whether they be the device themselves to change or update or do show commands or whatever, or if it's to come into the network to use network resources. So authentication says who's allowed to use those resources. Authorization is what can they do. So once authenticated, what are we allowing them to do with those resources or on our network or on our device. And lastly, accounting, what they did. Okay, so it's what they did, how long they did it for. I can do a start-stop record which says, okay, I want to account for or log everything they're doing from the beginning to the end, and then save that log. So AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Authentication's who, authorization is what they can do, accounting is what they did. There are two types of AAA modes that we can look at: character mode and packet mode. Character mode is used for most remote administration of the device. So I want to connect directly into that device. So in most of our examples here, we're going to use routers. So as we look at the router, I'm an administrator, and there's something wrong with it. Maybe a part of the network is down, and so I want to go ahead and I want to look at that interface. Unfortunately, I'm sitting at home, and I don't want to run into the office. So one of the things I can do is I can set up my AAA server that allows me to authenticate into that router remotely. And then I can go ahead and look at that router. You can tell that you're in AAA character mode when you see commands like exec, enable, or login in the AAA command set. Packet mode is used for access to the network. And oftentimes it's used for end users. So they want access, maybe they come in through a VPN. That's probably pretty common. They use the PPP protocol. They're using some sort of network protocol. They're coming in to get access to the network. They're not configuring the device. They're not messing with the device. What they want is they want to be allowed access to use a resource inside of the network. So character mode, most often used for remote administration of the device. Packet mode is used for access to the network or access to network resources. And you'll notice packet mode by the commands network and PPP, and in some iOS's VPN group. So now let's look at the commands that it takes to configure AAA. And in this brief video, we're looking mostly at theory and we're looking at authentication. There will be future videos that we will look at the actual configuration. But here we're just looking at what are the commands being used and what do they do. So first thing we got to do when we go into the device is we've got to enable AAA. So if you try to do a AAA authentication command or authorization or accounting, and you don't get that option, likely it's because AAA wasn't enabled yet on that device. So we'll use the AAA new model command to enable AAA. Then we've got to configure our method lists. And those would be, in the form of the command is here, AAA, and I can choose either authentication, authorization, or accounting. Then I can use the default list, or I can specify a particular name, and then I'll list my methods. You can list up to 4 methods. We list the methods so that we have a backup plan, meaning let's say one of our methods is a server. So we're going to authenticate to a server. If that server is down, maybe I'm having network issues, maybe that's the whole reason why I'm trying to get into the router or the device. If I'm having network issues and my server is down, it will go to method 2. Okay, so methods are a backup list. If the first method, if the server is up, and I've just simply entered in the wrong username and password, then I won't be allowed in. But if the server's down, it will actually go and check the next method and allow you to try to authenticate that way. Lastly, and optionally, we can configure lockout. So if someone tries a bunch of times to log into the device or into our network, after a certain number of attempts, it will just lock that username. So that can hopefully prevent some of the brute force attacks and things like that from someone getting into our network that way. So we have to enable AAA. Then we've got to configure our method list. We could first do an authentication. We'll look mostly at authentication here, an authentication method list, and then we can create a method list for authorization. So if you're authenticated, what am I going to authorize you to do? Most often authorization is done with a server-based solution. And then lastly, we can account. We would do a start-stop record or a delay-start record for accounting and logging of what they're doing once they're there. And again, accounting is often used with just a server-based solution. So what are the differences? We've got 2 different ways we can configure AAA. We can configure AAA to use the local database, or we can configure it to use a server for authentication, authorization, and accounting. The local database uses usernames and passwords that are configured on the router. So I've configured a username called user1 on my router. I use the username, user1 password, and whatever the user1 password command is, I put that globally on the router. I can have a whole list of those commands in this router. So when Sally, I don't know, I'm just going to call her Sally. So when Sally over here decides that she needs to administer this router, she's going to communicate directly with the router. The router is going to look locally in its own configuration to find user1. Sally types in user 1. The router looks up in its own configuration, finds user 1, finds the password for user 1, gives Sally the password prompt, and waits for her to respond with the proper password before allowing her access to the device. Now differently, we have a server, and this is we often use servers in medium to large installations. If I have a real small installation, then I might want to use the local database, but most often I'm going to use a server if I have multiple users that need to use AAA or to get into our devices or to use our resources. With a server-based solution, the router communicates with a server to authenticate the user. So this time, Sally comes into the router. She wants to get in. The router takes her username and then requests the authentication server. So gives that to the authentication server and says, I need to know, is this user in your database? And if it is, the router will then get that information from the authentication server, go ahead and prompt Sally for a password. Sally then sees the prompt, types in her password. The router then communicates with the server. In this case, the router is the client, then communicates with the server and says, okay, this is the username I have, user 1. Do you have that in your database? Yes, you do. This is the password I was given for user 1. Does that match? And if it does, Sally will gain access to the router. If it doesn't, Sally's authentication will fail and she won't get access to the router. So the difference is everything's local on the router with local database. You configure the username and passwords. With the server, the database is configured on some sort of authentication server. So first let's look at the local database. So here's an example of configuring the router to use a local database. First, you've got to configure the local username and password. So you go to the global configuration mode, the command username, the user you want, in this case it's user 1, password, in this case user 1 pass. Of course, you can pick any usernames and passwords you want. These are just the two we chose. Then we're going to go ahead and we're going to enable AAA using the AAA new model command. And then we're going to configure local authentication. So what I did is I said AAA authentication. I want to authenticate login. I'm going to use the default list. I'm not going to create my own list. And I want them to log in local or look at the local database, which is this username and password that I've configured up here to allow people in. I could also use a command called local-case, which would then mean that the username and the password are case sensitive. Lastly, I want to make sure that if someone attempts to log in 3 times and they fail every time, that username is then failed. So let's say that I have got a great technician whose name is Bob, and I have a username on my local database called Bob, and somebody else has figured out that there's a username named Bob. So once they know the username, they know half of what they need to get into my device. So what I don't want to have happen is someone to type in Bob as the username and to do some sort of dictionary or brute force attack to try to find out Bob's password. So what will happen is I'm going to configure lockout such that after 3 attempts, Bob's username is disabled. It will no longer respond to anyone trying to type in the username Bob. I'm going to do that using the AAA login, authentication, attempts, max fail, and then the number of attempts. And in this example, it's 3. Now the other option we have is to use AAA, configure AAA to use a server, to look at a server database for its information. And the 2 protocols used to communicate between the client and the server that we have available to us right now are Radius and TACACS+. You can really refer to it just as TACACS, so everyone will know that you mean TACACS+ when you say TACACS. So from this point on, that's what we'll do. These protocols are only used between the client and the server. And in our previous example of our picture, the client is the router, and the server is, the Radius or the TACACS or the Cisco Secure ACS server that we've configured, whatever we've configured on that box. There's a couple things you need to know about Radius and TACACS. Radius is the open standard. It uses UDP ports. It had legacy ports of 1645 and 1646, and when I do a demonstration later, you'll notice that we'll check for those ports because likely the router is set to 1645 and 1646, but the server we're using will be using current ports of 1812 and 1813. So port 1645 and 1812, okay, if I'm using legacy device or if I'm using current port numbers, are used for authentication and authorization, and 1646 and 1813 are used for accounting. Radius also combines the functions of authentication and authorization, but has incredibly detailed accounting capabilities, so oftentimes Radius would be used for accounting. The downfall of Radius, or what could be considered a downfall, is it's not quite as secure as TACACS. It encrypts only the password, so the password that's being sent between the router and the server is the only part that's encrypted. So anything that happens after that or between them after that is not encrypted. The username's not encrypted, the payload's not encrypted. So just something to pay attention to. TACACS, on the other hand, is Cisco proprietary and works with most Cisco devices. It separates all AAA functions. So whereas Radius combines authentication and authorization, TACACS doesn't. Each function is separate. And one of the cool things about TACACS is that it can authorize specific commands for each user or for a group of users. And that's something Radius can't do. It can't say you're going to get this command for user 1 and these 4 commands for user 2 or for a particular group. So that's kind of a neat thing. TACACS uses port 49 and it encrypts all of the packet, not just the password. So that's some of the differences between the two, and you'll use them for different things. One of the cool things that we'll look at later is Cisco Secure ACS is capable of using both Radius and TACACS. So if I want to use them both, I could use the accounting feature of Radius and the really cool separation of the AAA functions, or the authentication or authorization, the authorization function of TACACS in the same server. So that is kind of a neat thing. So lastly, we're just going to look at a quick example of how to configure the device to use a server. And in this example, we're going to use a Radius server because a lot of times I use WinRadius because it's free. And so a lot of my examples will show some of that. Here we're going to use a Radius server. Same thing we did before. Now the only difference is I don't have to configure a local username and password. I'm going to assume that my local username and password is still on there from before. And so then I'm going to use it later at the bottom as an example, but I'm not going to configure it in this example. So first thing I want to do is I want to enable AAA new model. And of course it could still be configured from before, but these are just the steps that are needed to configure the server, or to configure the device for the server, assuming I'm not using local username and passwords, but I am going to use that a little bit later. So first I want to enable AAA new model. Then I'm going to configure an authentication list to use, or an authentication method list to use Radius. If the Radius server is down, then use the local database, and that's where that local username and password is going to come in. So I use the AAA authentication login. Default group is Radius. So first I want to use the Radius server. If for some reason the Radius server is down, then go ahead and use local. Use whatever is configured as a local username and password. That's what's going to happen. Now remember, keep in mind, if this Radius server is up and running and communicating with this router, yet you have put in the wrong or entered the wrong username and password, it doesn't default to local. It just fails. You won't be allowed into the device. And next I've got to configure, remember specifically because this device could be using the older legacy ports and my Radius server isn't, I always have to configure the Radius host, but now I'm also going to specify the ports to make sure that I'm not using legacy ports anywhere, otherwise they won't communicate. So now I've got to specify where is the Radius server. Okay, so you're saying up here you want me to use a Radius server, but I need to know how to get to it. So that command is Radius server host, the IP address of where the Radius server is. Okay, so how do I get to that server? The authorization port, it's actually authorization and authentication, is 1812. The accounting port is 1813. And the key, or the password, is test radius. This password is used for the router, in this case, or the client, to authenticate directly with the server. That way we know we don't have a rogue device trying to get in and use the server, or the server trying to get in to the router, so vice versa. This password is used not for the user. The user's not, they're still going to use whatever username and password they think they have in the database. This password is only used, or this key is used between the router and the Radius server. And lastly, just as a neat example here, TACACS, as I said earlier, does give more control over authorization, and one of the things we can do is we can specify AAA authorization commands at privilege level 0 to 15. So by default, I might have an authorization level of 15, but I really only want user 1 to be able to do have commands that are in privilege level 1. So instead I would do AAA authorization commands 1, default group TACACS plus local. If you tried to configure this and put Radius here, so these three things here don't go with this thing down here. This is just an example. If you tried to do Radius here, it would actually come back with an error and say there's no TACACS server configured. It would actually let you put in the command, but then later it would come to the console afterwards saying, hey, there's no TACACS server configured. So that's it for this one. I actually thought it was going to be a little more brief. I tried to make it shorter, but I hope you got the theory information you need. And in further videos, we'll try to look at some of the configuration, and we'll look at